Hey, a really warm welcome to everybody who's here today. I'm delighted to have the really lovely job of welcoming you into this webinar. We've been really pleased with the amount of interest that this webinar and others in this series have generated. There are a lot of people who are interested in issues of climate education and keen to discuss and learn more about that. Um, I'm welcoming you here on behalf of the University of Oxford's Education Deanery. The Deanery's mission is to support educators in their understanding and use and co-production of research evidence in education, and to provide spaces where teachers and researchers can come together and learn from each other. And so we're absolutely delighted that in the first year of our relaunch, with a lot of help from our Norham Fellows, Kim Polgreen and Travis Fuchs, we've been able to connect with a community of educators who are really passionate about and interested in issues of climate education. And this webinar is one in a series of events that this fabulous working group are putting together in the local area. And so at the end of the webinar, we'll give you a little bit of information also about an upcoming history-focused webinar. And then that will be followed up by an in-person event in the summer term this year. So do stay tuned for more details about what this brilliant group of educators are up to. And you can find details of all of our upcoming events on the Deanery website, which I'm just popping into the chat there. But I expect you've seen that because that's probably how you have signed up to this one. Please be aware, you should have had a little notification that today's webinar will be recorded, and that that's in order to share what is spoken about today more widely. So just to be aware of that, and if you'd rather not be on camera, please be mindful that if you do turn your camera on, then your image will be recorded. Right. I think that's all of the sort of key housekeeping. Throughout the webinar today, it's going to be quite an informal format, a discussion between English teaching experts. If you have any questions that you would like to drop into the chat, please do that. Please feel free to go ahead. And I think in a moment, Phoebe will also explain there are going to be opportunities for discussion throughout the afternoon today. And so all that remains for me to do is to really warmly welcome our speakers today. So we have Pablo, Tess, Phoebe and Megan. Pablo and Tess both work within the University of Oxford, teaching and researching English, and both have an interest in environmental issues. And Phoebe and Megan both have long and rich, interesting backgrounds in the teaching of English at school level. And so we're going to have a really interesting discussion today about interconnections between university level work and the curriculum actually in our secondary schools. Let me hand you over now then. Is it Phoebe, are you going to take the helm from here?
It's me, actually.
It's you, Megan, sorry. Okay, and whilst I hand over to you, I will just pop a little bio for each of our speakers into the chat so that the participants can see a bit more about who you all are.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for that intro. And it's really nice to have you join us this afternoon from, I think, quite a range of places, potentially. And just a little bit more about what to expect over the next hour or so. We're going to have a fairly informal discussion with Pablo and Tess for the next sort of 30 minutes, covering the nature of environmental humanities and what kind of teaching and interesting work is going on at the university, and then also where are the connection points to our teaching within the secondary curriculum. And then we're going to make sure there's a slot of sort of 5 or 10 minutes to specifically address those questions that might come up in response. So as Laura mentioned, a chance to definitely put your ideas into the chat. And then subsequently, we're going to finish off with some breakout rooms where we actually apply what we've been thinking about in the first part of the discussion to some texts that Pablo and Tess have chosen for us. So again, an interactive element where we get to put our sort of literary analytical skills to the test. And have a good chance to chat with colleagues, and then we'll all come back together at the end. So that's what's to expect. Please feel free up front if you have an idea already about either a text or a topic or a part of the curriculum that you think is particularly ripe for some environmental kind of injections. Feel free to put that up in the chat up front, and it may be that we can weave those into the discussion as well. Fantastic. I won't take up any more time with outlines. We really want to move now into the discussion with Pablo and Tess, Phoebe and myself. And to start, if we can, with the kind of question of, really, what is the environmental humanities? Could you give us a brief introduction to the nature of environmental humanities within the university and what kind of environmental research and teaching is going on at the moment? So I don't know whether Pablo or Tess, you want to start?
Tess, do you want to take the first response, and I can come in with the kind of institutional history of it?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Pablo. Thanks, Megan. I mean, the most literal definition of environmental humanities, I suppose, is the humanistic disciplines engaging with environmental questions and issues, right? And approaching the environment as a cultural phenomenon and environmental issues as cultural issues. So thinking about, how do humans think about nature and the environment? What are the stories we tell about the environment? What are the assumptions that we've inherited? What are our environmental histories? That would be my kind of overview, I think, of the environmental humanities. Pablo?
Yeah, thanks, Tess. I just wanted to it might be useful to remind us of how this field formed institutionally and otherwise, and a brief history of that. So the standard account of this, as people like Robert Emmett and David Nye, in a kind of standard book in the field, The Environmental Humanities, A Critical Introduction, published in 2017, they track it back really to the beginning of the 21st century. So they talk about how it's in the beginning of 21st century, in their words, a new academic field emerged, environmental humanities. And then they go and say that one can trace the origins of environmental humanities as a subject back more than a century. But the field, in their opinion, originated most immediately, I'm quoting them here, through a confluence of simultaneous developments during the 1970s and 1980s in departments of literature, philosophy, history, geography, gender studies, and anthropology. So I guess a couple of things to note here, and the two institutions they identify, one is a cluster of Australian researchers who adopt the name Ecological Humanities in the 1990s, and then the MIT MacArthur Workshop on Humanistic Studies of Environment, 1991 to 1995. So that's a kind of brief sketch of how the subject came to appeared in the institutional context of higher education, by and large, in North America, Australia, and parts of Britain. So there are a couple of things to say about that. One is, given that timeline, there's already been a very long history of teaching the kinds of relationships that Tess has just talked about, both inside and outside higher education, inside and outside school, etc., globally. So one of the things that interests me about the definition is they're kind of, they miss out parts of their history of that, what has already been going on pedagogically and otherwise. For example, in the Global South for about over 100 years or so by that time. But also the mixture of disciplines that they're talking about, which is really interesting, and the kinds of perspectives that each of those disciplines bring into rethinking the relationships between quote unquote nature and culture. That's the kind of, I suppose, history of environmental humanities, how it's come to us today. And it might be a good thing for all of us to be aware of that history, its various possibilities, but also the various gaps in that kind of institutional formation.
Sorry, yeah, we have the other term as well, don't we, of eco-criticism?
Yeah.
Related term, and obviously a kind of notoriously difficult word to define, but I always find it useful to think of it in terms of the study of representations of the environment in literature and other arts and media and so on, that is interested in the ethics and the politics of that representation, right? So not just a kind of, you know, nature in Keats or whatever it might be, but something that's interested in the ethics. How does this literature, this art, engage ethically with environmental concerns? And people often talk about the development of eco-criticism in terms of waves, which is a nice kind of natural image. You had in the 1990s, you had the so-called first wave with people like Jonathan Bate, who was the head of Worcester, my college in Oxford. And the first wave is often thought of as being quite romantic, I guess, right? Interested in kind of beautiful and sublime representations of nature and literature that can teach us to love nature and care for it and be closer to it. And then you had the second wave, the so-called second wave in the 2000s, which was more interested in doing what you were describing, Pablo, kind of challenging, asking what is the relationship between nature, culture, human, non-human, are we kind of entangled together? It was more interested in environmental issues like climate change, pollution, sustainability. And it started kind of widening the perspective to take into account different voices, questions of race, gender, class. And now we're in the so-called third wave, which I guess is a kind of expansion of that, trying to increase the kind of perspectives that we can think about and listen to in eco-criticism, thinking about different local environments, different local knowledges, local literatures. And we've even had the so-called material turn, which is interested in non-human agencies, non-human perspectives, even non-living agencies, you know, the agency of the weather, for example, or of stone or water and so on. So the field is moving, is quite fast-paced, I think, compared to a lot of fields of criticism.
I mean, one thing you might want to add to that is in terms of Tess, how you've presented the waves. There's a prehistory of those waves coming by and large out of the North American creative writing movement in the 1970s and 80s, or even earlier, late 1960s, where precisely what happens is the kind of turn to nature as a way of thinking about a solution or even a solace to the kinds of problems that we see in North American urban formations distinctly around that time. So there's a kind of drawing on 19th century heritage of wilderness, frontier, etc. that happen, and then that kind of feeds into the first wave critical moments of the 1990s. The other thing that happens, and this is where the slippage between eco-criticism and environment becomes well, in some senses palpable, is from the urban geography sort of field, distinctive works about pollution, for example. So I'm thinking of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that starts to appear, that disputes that kind of unproblematic turn towards nature, that then feeds into the kind of second wave of criticism that you are always already talking about. Another development that happens is environment becomes a category of that historians, particularly historians of the global South, start working with seriously, with environmentalism of the poor, coming from India and Brazil, that also feed into that kind of second wave moment. So in other words, there's a kind of interesting institutional history of the subject in Britain and North America. And then there's a global history of the field that has various directions that feed into the waves that you're talking about. I'm really interested to know whether any of this and how this percolates into, for example, primary or secondary school education over this period, because the whole 70s to now is, of course, precisely the moment when climate change and environment become headlines globally, right? Because of you know what we now kind of documenting as anthropogenic climate change from roughly the mid to late 70s onwards. So it'd be interesting to know how any of this discussion, or in what form it has percolated out of the institutions that we've already talked about in terms of university teaching and university research.
Thanks both. And perhaps just before we move on, and in a few minutes to kind of talk about the secondary curriculum, and maybe we'll try and answer that in part. It'd be really great to know, so then how students who are studying English at university, how they then encounter what you've described, and maybe just say a little bit about what you each teach that kind of shows the possibilities, I guess, of either eco-criticism or the environmental humanities more generally.
Yeah. Tess, go.
Yeah, so thank you. I research and teach literature from 1550 to 1830. So literature that is kind of dated sort of usually before the so-called Anthropocene, before the kind of modern ecological crisis. And what I'm really interested in is, how do we read historical literature through the lens of our current and ecological moment? And I found it astonishing, really, how students engage with environmental questions, and it kind of enlivens, I suppose, a lot of old, even sometimes very canonical literature, making it seem relevant, to kind of use that bugbear word. I also teach a new third-year option in the English faculty at Oxford called Elements of Criticism, which aims to introduce students to eco-critical theory and also looks at literature from 1500 right up to the present day, so really broad historical sweep. And we organize that around the elements. We have a week on water, air, earth, fire, and that has been it's really good fun. I think it's a really good fun way to bring together seemingly very disparate texts, but using environmental concepts and approaches to sort of illuminate conversations, continuities across big periods and genres. Pablo.
Yeah, so as Tess has just described, I mean, environmental thinking or environmental criticism is a really good way to scramble our senses of space and time. So one of the things that we find really exciting is to how you rethink our own curriculum and syllabus, how the organizational principles of that, how that changes drastically. So Tess has already talked about how, for example, the notion of the modern immediately changes from certain confines to, let's say, the last 500 odd years, when you're talking about environment and climate as a way of thinking about that period. So I guess I've taught aspects of this across the undergraduate and the graduate curriculum. So, for example, for the master's courses, I teach a course on called Energizing World Literature, which is about energy humanities, how the thinking about energy has been historically and culturally informed for the last 200 odd years. I've taught courses. There's a third-year course I teach on. It doesn't sound very environmental because its title is Spies, Ghosts, and Detective Spies and Ghosts, about in the 19th century. But each of those categories, detective, spies, and ghosts, are actually ways of thinking about things such as environment, energy, climate, in a very broad literary field. I lecture on world literature and world energy to first years and second years. So I guess and this wasn't the case when I started teaching in Britain full time in 2000 exactly. So what I have noticed over 24 odd years is how embedded the discussion about environment as a problem and approach has become in every level of undergraduate and graduate curricula. In fact, across Britain, because before Oxford, I taught in other places for a very long time at Warwick and so on. And that's been one of the biggest changes I've seen in the curriculum over 30 odd years.
I think now pretty much every English degree will give the students at least an opportunity to think about these things, won't it?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that the secondary curriculums kind of match what's happening at tertiary level in terms of all those that way of thinking being embedded. And I think, I don't know if you'd agree, Megan, but I think you might get some kind of discrete units that focus on something specifically environmental, but kind of threading that mindset and approach through everything you teach. I definitely don't think we're quite there yet. Although what you said, Tess, about it enlivening debate, I think that's where I've been bringing it into the curriculum in my school. That's kind of what we see. It's the philosophical kind of element wakes up a lot of students in an English class who may not be there willingly, and they enjoy kind of applying it to the world around them and kind of bringing in that idea of kind of of social justice and environmental justice, and it can make things a lot livelier. I think, I mean, yeah, what would you add, Megan?
Well, I'd agree with you, and I think there has been no kind of systematic, institutionalized kind of framing of it within secondary English teaching. I think one of the problems we encounter in secondary schools is an effective kind of siloing of that topic into the sciences and geography where it's felt to sit, and a kind of, a lack of the more generalized awareness of those cultural dimensions that you've been describing so eloquently. I mean, there are long traditions in sort of primary and secondary education of, I guess, education for sustainable development and environmental education and sort of place-based and outdoor learning. And those strands have quite a rich sort of research history. And I think there's a lot of practice that's been done in thinking through those things. But in terms of the kind of more discipline-specific kind of pedagogy, that's still, I think, got a long way probably to catch up with what you're describing, a much more kind of integrated sort of institutionalized development, but there's huge opportunities, as Phoebe's saying, and huge probably real interest and appetite from quite a range of teachers, but needing that kind of guidance almost about how to take what is a really fast-moving discipline, as you've described, and turning it into something we can use in the classroom, and thinking about what different questions we can ask of the kind of texts that we might be thinking about anyway.
So I have a question for you both and for other teachers in the room. So that's really interesting for us, and that's also bears out my experience of working with school teachers and being a parent. So my experience, my sense is certainly in Britain, it is exactly school teachers and school children who are often at the forefront and take up leading roles in public, let's say, ecological or environmentally conscious movements. So, and that there's a mismatch, isn't there? So in how we've described the university, the disciplinary aspect of it, although it's a kind of slightly idealized picture that we have drawn, because we have the same siloing effect, the same kind of STEMs taking lead, et cetera, that happens in university. At least there's a disciplinary history there, which is not always matched by either the commitment on the part of the schools or the university or the student body or the staff body to publicly make those arguments in the way school teachers and school students have. I'm thinking here, for example, of the climate strikes that Oxford schools ran for over a year, which is not exceptional. That's a global event. So there's a kind of mismatch between what school teachers and school children globally and in Britain and other places have done on the streets and the curriculum, and precisely the opposite seemed to be happening in the universities, where it's got a, relatively speaking, heftier curricular presence, but a much thinner history or record of trying to match that curriculum to actually translating that into non-institutional action. So that seems to be the most important, interesting to me, the part of that disjunction. And part of the matching up might be, in every university meeting, I always propose to include school leaders and school teachers and school children in order to tell universities how to translate theory into action. In a sense, the schools have already done it and I have good experience and record of doing it. Whereas the university might be able to do slightly different things in terms of the joining up movement. So that's the most, from what you both say, that's the most interesting thing to me.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because actually one of my theories about kind of student activism is that it's partly a product of frustration that their schools often can't satisfy. their desire to learn about the issues of kind of climate and
Yep.
ecology. So I suppose some of the students that Phoebe and I encounter, we actually run something called the Oxford School Sustainability Network with Kim, who's also here. And we encounter a lot of the students who kind of really care about these things within their schools and often find there isn't perhaps enough space. And certainly from a curricular point of view, often not enough going on. And that sometimes is what feeds the kind of external action, is their sense of, you know, I'm not sort of getting this met within school, and actually I need to go out on the streets or wherever it might be. And of course, there are students who might do that anyway. So I guess that's only a part of an answer, but it might actually be kind of partly an indicator of the fact that schools haven't systematically integrated the kind of learning that many students are calling for. And I suppose another thing is to acknowledge that the really interesting work that is being done on kind of environmental pedagogy at school level does seem to be really effectively focused on the idea that that kind of learning needs to be the kind of learning that is about empowering action and change, so that it's very direct, it's kind of hope-based often, and also, yeah, very much about, there's no point just kind of learning these things in theory, but that the kind of pedagogy we want to employ is something that will actually create kind of transformative change in students. And there is that rich legacy of kind of critical pedagogy, which I think is being drawn on there and kind of turned in an environmental direction, the idea that learning is actually sort of about social transformation. So I think there is really interesting pedagogical thinking emerging, but there's a kind of translation question of how teachers have the time and the sort of support and the capacity to integrate that into the curriculum. And bearing in mind that the English curriculum is now 10 years old. So, you know, it's quite slow moving, and the idea that you're still working with something that was framed quite a long time ago, when there's all this kind of rapid acceleration in the way we think about the environment generally in society and culture and in pedagogy.
One point of maybe cautious optimism, I suppose, would be that although, as you say, curricula are so difficult to shift, you know, and you know, the curriculum in Oxford has been pretty broadly similar for quite a long time as well.
Much longer than 10 years, Des.
I mean, Megan says 10 years, but actually it was 10 years that the curriculum got revised so that it was kind of more similar to something from longer ago. So yeah.
I mean, of course we want other kinds of text to be brought into these eco-critical conversations. The only sort of point of relief, I guess, is that even in, say, a really historical, canonical type of structure, like certainly the Oxford curriculum and most school curriculums, the texts that are there still do already reward environmental approaches. One of my favorite classes I teach is on Shakespeare and the environment, and we look at King Lear and A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that's great fun. And it's, you know, like we said, it's kind of asking, how do these, you know, really old canonical texts kind of accrue new meaning in the 21st century? So although there is, as you're both saying, we want these things to be kind of codified in some way, you know, formalized, to really enable people to make the most of them. But there is a lot that I think can be done without taking up enormous amounts of time, even, you know, a class, a seminar here or there fitting into an existing curriculum or structure can start to raise some of these questions.
I think I was coming back a bit to the kind of role of English in literature. I mean, what you were saying, Pablo, about the kind of schools' kind of capacity for action, or their kind of imagination for taking action. I think that it is kind of limited, really, because it's a matter of funding. So I think that Megan's right. It's an expression of kind of frustration. And then quite a lot of what happens in English is perhaps that we explore, or teachers explore, the writing of protest, or they look more at creative writing as a means to kind of soothe eco-anxiety. And then the bit where you're kind of critically interrogating those relationships between nature and culture and environment that you were talking about, that's kind of, there's lots of scope for that, but the kind of that it isn't quite coming down from where you are to where we are, I guess. But I think something that we kind of talked about a little bit before is that actually it's also perhaps a need to think in a more interdisciplinary way that is quite easy to achieve within school because it's a smaller space with fewer subjects, basically. How important do you think that is at a tertiary level, and what's kind of, if you're in environmental humanities, you know, is everybody talking to everybody, or is, you know, how, if you're studying literature but you're interested in geography, like, can talk us through what actually happens for people making those connections?
Tess, do you want to go, or?
I can do. I mean,
Well,
I think, as I'm sure you'll say as well, Pablo, we wish it could happen more, and we wish there were more opportunities for it. I would say I do think the environmental humanities is better at it than a lot of fields. I co-organized a conference a few years ago called Mediating Climate Change at the University of Leeds, that was attended by humanists, social scientists, and kind of hard scientists, earth scientists, physicists, and it was completely fascinating. And there were a lot of instances where people were kind of struggling to talk across these disciplinary divides, but it was all in good faith, and I think really produced some interesting conversation. So I think it is happening. It takes a lot of effort to actually just to organize a venue in which that can happen.
Yeah, I would. My experience is very similar, Tess. And so I guess going back to your question, Phoebe, about how much people are talking to each other. So part of what we come up against, and this will be familiar to in school, is the kind of siloed nature, not just of teaching, but of how funding streams work. So a lot of, in universities, a lot of the environmental, for obvious reasons, a lot of the environmental issues are already massively well funded in certain subjects as opposed to others. So the conversation between researchers in those subjects are kind of framed by that inequality of funding and space and everything else. Having said that, the example that just Tess gave, I mean, my experience of eHum as a field is that precisely because of the origins that I was trying to sketch out via those opening remarks about how institutions came to teach them, because it already came as a collaborative effort between scholars, certainly within humanities, working across very different fields, and social sciences also. There's a kind of hardwired or inbuilt propensity or willingness to engage in conversations across those fields. Certainly in certain forums like the conferences that Tess was talking about, research clusters, etc., that is better provisioned than, for example, teaching. So I would love to teach a course, and I did this just before joining Oxford a few years ago when we started an environmental humanities masters at Warwick, where from the entry level of what we are requiring students to bring to their master's program, to who can teach on the master's program, we tried to collaborate as much as possible, i.e. we would jointly teach someone working in earth sciences and myself, or someone from geography and myself. And classroom, that really makes, if there's institutional space for that, that really triggers amazing classroom teaching and learning, but also outside the classroom teaching and learning. So I suppose this is a long-winded way of saying, one of the first hurdles you want to cross is how you translate research collaborations into teaching collaborations into institutions that are not always well geared to do so. Because of the spread and the inequities built into the university system, that is a ongoing battle to be won. The research conversations, I think, as Tess has pointed out, has got a much better track record of the kinds of conversation you're talking about. The challenge is, how do we translate that into classrooms? What happens when we teach together with an earth scientist or a volcanologist or whatever? That's the big thing. And there you come up against the kind of curricular and degree structures that need to be changed.
I do think sorry.
No, go on.
I was just going to say that the kind of growth in growth and sort of excitement around environmental humanities, I do think makes an argument for the benefits of having an interdisciplinary education as well, the benefits of having scientific literacy of some level, if you are, even if you're going to do an English degree, for example. Having, you know, a couple of science A levels, for example, is you know,
which you have, haven't you, Tess? You've got
I did maths and physics. I did, and I think I like to think it's kind of helped in my environmental humanities research. It kind of shaped some of my literary interests as an undergraduate. But I think certainly in terms of admissions for English degrees, a big variety of subjects across arts and humanities is, you know, is absolutely great. You know, just as you know, languages or history or whatever are useful to equip you for these degrees, so too can the sciences be, and you can kind of articulate those connections in an application.
I think that it's good to have you on record saying that you know, when applying for university, a mix of subjects is good, which is something that I do tell my sixth form students. But also, yeah, I think that I've forgotten what I was going to say. So I think we should allow other people to ask some questions, but I think maybe before they do, can I kind of just ask a basic question, which is, Megan and I threw together an example of a typical curriculum for you both in secondary with kind of frequently occurring topics. And so if this works, maybe as a first question, can you tell us, have you any remarks to make on that curriculum, or did you see any opportunities for kind of teaching eco-crit or environmental perspectives? And whilst they answer that, everyone else, please, if you have a question, do put it in the chat.
Well, I already mentioned Shakespeare and how rewarding Shakespeare is for these kinds of approaches. There's a great book recently called Weathering Shakespeare, all about weather and climate in Shakespeare's plays and in performances of Shakespeare. So, I mean, I think pretty much any Shakespeare play where you could put together a really nice kind of session or course on how Shakespeare is thinking about you know, the relationship between human and environment, and how you stage the non-human, how do you get the environment kind of onto the stage. Shakespeare is really interested in those questions. So that those texts, you know, got the, you know, things like The Tempest, I already mentioned, Midsummer Night's Dream, they're kind of ripe for this kind of treatment.
Great.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, the thing about the curriculum is you can teach anything, every topic and every book on that list you could teach with environmental humanities in mind. So this is the thing about eHum, because it's not so much what content of the curriculum is how you teach it and what method you can bring to it to open up the entire possibility of thinking with texts, right? So you could have you could not, you know, you don't have to change a single text there, and you can have a full curriculum of eHum teaching. Or you could think about, for example, see whether there is, because this is a global phenomenon and a global concern, could you think about adding in, and I'm always slightly cautious of recommending this because of the kind of workload implications and preparation implications for everyone, whether there are more texts you can think about, for example, from the 3 global southern continents, and how that would, what would that mean if you teach, if we think, let's say, go with Shakespeare, of the Shakespeare example, to teach any Shakespeare text that you want to, alongside someone like Kalidas from South Asia, right? What would it look like then? So that's I suppose the 2 things about curriculum is you don't have to change it at all to teach eHum. You can teach exactly what you want to do in a completely different way, or you can make it really comparative and think about what a British curriculum or an Australian curriculum or a Canadian curriculum, what would it mean to engage with a world problem like weather or climate or environment? How does it then look? What does it mean to be educated or be climate literate via that curriculum once it's not I suppose, nation focused. So yeah, you could go either way or both.
And could I just add to that, probably, yeah, in response, I mean, you're right that you always have to think about the implications of what it means for teachers to sort of expand in that way. But in kind of one of my other projects, I'm working on this module for UCL called Teaching for Sustainable Futures. And one of the key principles coming out in that module is precisely the like expanding to kind of global, more global reach possibilities, and indeed maybe thinking about Indigenous literature as well, but also finding those possibilities where they do exist, so where there are ways in. And I was thinking particularly of texts like Things Fall Apart, which is fairly well established in school curricula. It's a GCSE text, and the kind of opportunities you get, and I think you're going to suggest another one with one of the texts that we look at in our breakout groups, because you've cited Heart of Darkness, haven't you? And there are some of those existing more globalized texts that provide really interesting ways in. And if we ask slightly different questions than the ones we're perhaps used to asking, though some of those things are already there. So that seems to me one of the best examples of how you can think really closely about our relationship to land and food and culture and survival and cultural sort of breakdown in ways that are essentially kind of eco-critical. They just might not be as familiar in the classroom yet. And I guess, well, just picking up on one, Kim's asked a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you, Kim. And just responding to one of those, because I think it really links up with what we were discussing a few minutes ago, the question of kind of how much literacy we need as English teachers then, how much scientific literacy. I think going back to the discussion we were having a few minutes ago about kind of interdisciplinary knowledge, like we can use our science colleagues, presumably, in theory, we could use them a lot more. But also, I mean, one of the things that I've always thought of as a strength of literature is its kind of carnivorous qualities, right? That in English, we do tend to sort of plunder from all sorts of places. And students are really interested, for example, in encountering forms of scientific discourse in non-fiction texts, or thinking about what does it mean to use kind of poetic language or scientific language, and sort of thinking about it through our own lens is maybe a way to overcome some of that, you know, that we're thinking about critically, what does it mean to describe something in this way rather than this way? You don't have to be an expert on the science itself. But there are lots of opportunities. I was just thinking of a missed opportunity on my part when I taught. I did a creative writing project with some students by first of all thinking about trophic cascades and mycorrhizal networks between trees, and then using that as the basis for kind of making poetry connections. But I totally failed to speak to the science teachers about, you know, where were they teaching trophic cascades and where could it fit in, and kind of joining the dots a bit better, maybe in the manner of a mycorrhizal network. So.
Yeah. If I can quickly jump in, that third question Kim's posted is absolutely key, it seems to me. About, you're absolutely right, Kim, about the headline commitment for every student to learn about climate change. What about people who are teaching it? As you will well know, the main problem, not just in Oxford but universities, I dare say globally, is by the time you're teaching in a university, you are extremely time poor, right? So in terms of training, we have to rethink about what training actually means for teachers. Like I would love to be trained in the kinds of things that all of you have just talked about, in terms of how you teach it collaboratively. So my shortcut to that has been basically trying to teach with as many people as possible outside the faculty. So that's been my shortcut in learning methods and picking up on the job, as it were, about how different colleagues, the example that you just gave about teaching poetry and forgetting to ask science colleagues, it's not even forgetting. I don't even have the space to remember that I need to ask someone. And I think this is trebly true of all of you working in primary and secondary schools. So that nature of the utter lack of work-life balance then militates against certain collaborative possibilities. So my shortcut has always been to find colleagues teaching in physics or geography or whoever, and say, this is what we want to teach. Do you want to teach together? And most of the time, that's not possible because of the degree structure. However, it is possible to find spaces institutionally to do that in. So last time we spoke, I gave that example about how the Vice Chancellor's colloquium this year is being about big public lectures with someone from STEM and someone from humanities doing joint lectures. And those, those had, 200, 300 students from across the university and members of public, where you basically teach for 2 hours together with a colleague you wouldn't otherwise within the curriculum structure. So those opportunities are there. We just need to learn to expand. And going back to Murray's question is how quickly you can learn from the job. So each of us will bring our own kind of disciplinary or pedagogic expertise, but it's from colleagues and students that you learn most quickly. I'm not sure, like yet another training program that you have to sign up for on top of everything else on how to teach environment will work in the space of the university or even schools as they exist. It's how we kind of collaborate, I suppose, and the opportunities to collaborate. And that seems to me the kind of really urgent thing.
I think your point, Pablo, about learning from students is a really important one that links to a couple of Kim's questions about teachers being anxious about their own literacy.
Yeah.
I think a lot of students will come with a lot of interest in what's on the news about the environment, for example, what's going on in different places in the world or in their own cities and so on. And students can actually bring a lot of that information themselves to teaching. And on Kim's first question about, again, applications, talking about an interest in climate change, I would say, if a student could link their interest in and their education in climate change to whatever subject it was they were applying, say, if a student said, I'm really interested in climate change, I want to come and study English and join these things together and approach one through the other. I think a lot of, university tutors and lecturers would be really excited to get to then talk to that student and to learn a lot from them.
Great. Okay. I think so. We've got kind of we've got some English teachers in the room and some teachers like Ian, who I think would really enjoy going into a breakout room and doing some exploration of text. So I think we should go ahead and do that with maybe almost just to have 2 groups perhaps or 3s. Tess and Pablo, are you okay to introduce the text that you've brought for discussion?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Tess, go ahead.
Yeah, so I brought the opening of the poem Darkness by Byron, which was written in 1816, known as the Year Without a Summer, because the eruption of the volcano Tambora in Indonesia basically covered the skies across Europe, America, parts of Africa, Asia, with a thick smog. The sun seemed to be dimmed. People were panicking. They didn't know what had caused this. And Byron wrote this poem, Darkness, when he was staying on the shores of Lake Geneva with Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein the same summer and so on. So a fascinating moment in literary history and in environmental history. So yeah, that's the opening of Darkness.
Yeah, and I've chosen a text from, in fact, the curriculum that Phoebe and Pip sent us, and which is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, novella of 1898, written approximately after a decade of Conrad researching this topic, with various travels in Congo and so on. When he starts the research, his primary interest in Belgian is in Belgian Congo and the rumors of atrocities coming out of there. When he writes the novel, that interest hasn't ebbed, but many other interesting things have happened, which makes the text such a both enigmatic and a rich example of how to think about things like race, gender, colonialism. In fact, I would say the history of modernity itself, by focusing on a part of the world that in 1898 was a source of both fascination and widespread fear and revulsion, certainly in Britain and the US. So that's a passage from Conrad's Heart of Darkness.